Martial mind over muscle. Hi, this is T.W. Smith, the host of Kung Fu Podcast, and welcome to the bonus episode of Martial Mind over Muscle. It's in association with the podcast number 170, Martial Arts is Action, Not Movement. You know, for the most part, we all practice our martial arts for social settings. Not many of us have to practice martial arts today, for example, for military settings or for even wilderness settings. Unless some of you are listening to the program and then going out into the wilderness like Bear Grylls and wrestling off some beast. Most of us practice or train to be in social interactions. In all seriousness, though, a couple of my most powerful memories are those associated with an encounter against an animal. The first one was when my dad was getting ready for highway patrol school in the early 1970s. I was just a boy at the time, probably about 8, and my younger brother and I was trying to follow him while he was on his jogs getting ready for patrol school. For the most part, we were on our bicycles as much as we could try to hang with him, and we were struggling to keep up. It was a hot summer afternoon, and it's just outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Then, as we're going, Dad stops, and this dog is barking. He says, "Hey, boys, get behind me and stay behind me." We kind of take a sneak peek looking around him, and what appears to be this huge German Shepherd running right towards Dad, barking. Dad settles back. The dog leaps at him, and he takes his left hand, he reaches up, grabs the dog by the throat, and he executes the Undertaker choke slam. There's a yelp, a flurry, and then the dog runs off back to where he came from. Dad tells us to take off through the woods to go back home, and of course, it seemed like we were running pretty hard in our little wet pants as he was finishing his jog. Well, you know, that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to do with the lesson, but it does. Martial mind over muscle. You know, having a strong mindset makes all the difference in the world, and learning how to use our mind in different ways was one of the things that we had talked about in martial action versus movement. So during this bonus episode, I'm going to review a couple things from podcast number 170. We're going to look at defining motor resonance in performance, motor resonance mind reading, the cognitive motor funnel, and how that leads to success taking more than just physical skill. There's going to be two systems that act for one action, and we're going to have a body language and how it transforms us from movement to action. Then I'm also going to share with you some of the exercises. We have about 12, but I'm going to share 5 here about the exercises that help you maintain the continuity of eye movement so that you can stay in your motor resonance during action. In Kung Fu Podcast number 170, we discussed action versus motion and how action always has a purpose and motion can be kind of incidental. We discussed how motor resonance is the neuroscience area of action interpretation. You see an action, you have an idea of what that action is being directed to, and then you make an interpretation or a forecast of what that action means. Motor resonance is the ability to recognize not only the action, the wave handling, or the object to which the action is targeted, for example, to me, but also the goal that is served by that action, for example, greeting me. It was here that we better defined our martial bodies, that in this theory, there really is no martial movement. There is martial action. Action serves a purpose. We want to remember that motor resonance is an attribute to help us understand actions and the goals that they're going to achieve through those actions, recognizing what that action is being directed at. And as Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, who lived from 1788 through 1860, he once said that talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target that no one else can see. What we'd like to try to do in our martial arts is get closer to being a genius than just a great talent, right? If we can see it before it actually comes, that's even better. So let's take a moment, since we're talking about action interpretation, and discuss wasted motion. In this area, I would say that quite often criminals have a distinct advantage. If you differentiate action as mechanics that have meaning being directed toward an object with an intention, then I would say that criminals have a distinct practice advantage. They don't waste any time. They don't waste any motion. They don't waste an inch or an angle. I would encourage you to listen to Ian Abernathy's podcast on 2 things that criminals know that you may not know. In a nutshell, he's going to walk you through the reasons why a criminal can do more with a brick than many high-ranking martial artists can do with 10 katas or forms. This is one of those areas where I got onto a student the other day for a lot of bouncing during his sparring. It was just wasted movement. He wasn't really trying to do anything with it except get his nervousness out. And I'm using some colorful words at the time. But in my mind, that was a lot of movement. That's not action. He wasn't trying to do anything else. He was just trying to keep his mind busy. You're not bouncing to set him up or distract him. Those are the things like using my blimp technique. Hey, right over there. Hey, officer. Those are the things that distract the enemy so that you could get a distinct advantage. But when you're bouncing just because you're nervous, that's a lot of wasted movement. A criminal doesn't bounce because of nervousness. He doesn't use movement very much at all. He's all about action, and he's going to use that action quickly and violently. His mechanics and his words are either ploys to keep you engaged for a sneak attack or to get inside of your space, inside your fence, which is exactly what he wants. Putting up your fence and working through your perimeter is something that we're going to work on at the Shuri-Te Bujitsu Kai International Conference coming up in April. If you get a chance, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/Shuri-Te and download all the information of some of the events that I'm going to be teaching at coming up here in the next few months. When we're looking at putting up a fence and coming out of it, we're trying to define motor resonance in performance. Here's what's happening, here's what I sense is happening, and then act upon that as quickly as possible. Joan Vickers published a study in the Cognitive Process Journal titled Mind Over Muscle, The Role of Gaze Control, Spatial Cognition, and the Quiet Eye in Motor Expertise. Vickers wrote, quote, "When the gaze is optimally controlled in space, then a state of motor resonance is achieved." I've borrowed the term motor resonance from Agliata in 2008, who found that achieving excellence in sports may be related to the fine-tuning of specific anticipatory resonance mechanisms that endow elite athletes' brains with the ability to predict others' actions ahead of their realization, end quote. Now, Sugar Ray Leonard, during his youth and prime, was incredibly gifted at the idea or concepts of motor resonance. He would literally strike into what appeared to be the window between thought and action of his opponent. Later, when he retired, he said he knew it was over because that window had shifted to where he had actually began to see the punch coming, where before he never saw the punch, he just saw the thought of a punch and struck into it, which would segue us into motor resonance mind reading. This is where the human mirror systems and the human mirror neurons are going to really click in. And a motor resonance theory of mind reading, it has evidence in the human mirror system. There have been weaknesses in the research in attempting to localize, saying, yeah, it's right specifically there, but there's no doubt that they're there. The mirror neurons are the cells in the theory that contribute to the motor resonance process. Professor Agnew writes, mirror neurons respond to the execution of an action and to the observation of a conspecific carrying out that same action. In Kung Fu Podcast number 170, I alluded to the fact that martial arts is an action art, not a movement art, because actions have meanings, movements do not. In fact, it is that differentiation that triggers our mirror neurons. Agnew writes, mirror activity is only reported in response to object and goal-related actions and not meaningless intransitive movements. Basically, if it doesn't have an action, it's not going to fire off the neuron. If it's just a movement, nothing's going to happen. The theory of mind is another concept that works with your mirror neurons to make that distinction. Our primary concern during this episode is understanding the stimulus that fire off that motor resonance process, because theory of mind can work and is tested in other areas, such as differentiating in beliefs. Professor Agnew wrote, quote, "Theory of mind refers to two concepts: the knowledge that other animals have mental states which may differ from our own, and the ability to infer what these internal states may be. Such states refer to beliefs, goals, intentions, or emotions. This term covers a range of skills which may or may not have overlapping neural bases," end quote. During the conclusions of their research, they write, "The evidence suggests that the human body may possess a mirror system distributed throughout the brain and peripheral nervous system, or a motor resonance. This implies the body has a range of mechanisms for mirroring external events that may be involved in understanding the cause and consequences of external events," which through this process brings us to the cognitive motor funnel. Many things passing through our brain, this small part of our brain, in a very time-sensitive manner. This has got to happen fast. In our martial arts training, we tend to realize when we're out a little further and we have a longer range, or when we're really up and tight, there's a lot of information moving through us that could be easily broken down in, let's say, tenths to a hundredths of a second. We know that feeling something can give us a much faster response than seeing it. Well, Joan Vickers' abstract sounds like she knows exactly what we're going through in our training. She writes, quote, "In the course of all motor behavior, the brain is limited how much information it can process and act upon at a time. Performers must constantly decide where to look, what to attend to, and how to time fixated information with precisely controlled actions. The gaze can be directed to only one location at a time, and information central to success must be selected from spatially complex environments, most often under severe time constraints." She continues with the writing after she mentions to athletes and law enforcement that this study will use by saying, "This paper describes the visual information and quiet eye characteristics that underlie the ability to make decisions under complex task conditions and the relationship between control of the gaze and task outcomes. With the attainment of motor expertise, measurable changes will occur within areas of the gaze, cognitive, and neural systems that are useful in training, rehab, and the treatment of motor deficits." Which leads us to a concept that if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. Success is going to take more than physical skill. Learning how to use your gaze is like finding and learning how to utilize a GPS. The researchers set a hypothesis and are going to demonstrate to achieve your optimal success, it's going to take more than just physical skill. They rigorously test people in realistic conditions by harnessing mobile eye tracking technology to discover how the visual system functions in physically challenging spaces and time frames. The research demonstrates, quote, "The greater or more intense the pressure, then the more the gaze must be precisely controlled in space and time relative to specific phases of the motor skill," end quote. Which leads to a question. Do you have gaze exercises in your training? Practicing the fixation of your gaze to either focus or awareness is one example. Having eye calisthenics to do it. Not to mention practicing keeping your eyes open while there's this hot mess flashing around you. None of that is easy. We go through specific sparring drills and exercises here that I refer to as training your eyes. And it's just something that you don't want to leave for chance to get better. Professor Vickers' research shows that highly skilled responses are achieved not through rapid shifting gaze, rather a quiet, steady, and calm gaze. You know, think about the cool and collected look. She likes to use the term quiet eye gaze for the activation of the GPS system and all of your reactions. She actually states, quote, "An optimal quiet eye period also acts like a GPS system that feeds into the brain with specific X, Y, and Z spatial coordinates that are needed for the action to be organized optimally in space over time. A long-duration fixation on a specific location contributes to better body positioning, a more balanced stance, and the timing and limb actions that are efficient and economical, end quote. Well, of course, as martial artists, we want to be efficient and economical, and for us older folks, we have to put even more emphasis on being efficient and economical because we're just poor old people. We don't have the gas to burn that you young bucks do. We have to learn to do more with less. This is where optimally using two systems for one action comes into play. In fact, in a lot of the references, this is where they start talking about time-sensitive decisions, for example, in SWAT team scenarios. Learning to place your gaze creates a clear path between the goal-directed system, which is called the top-down dorsal, and the stimulus-driven ventral system. You probably already know that anxiety disrupts the balance between these two systems. When your gaze is aligned properly with the task, it provides the data necessary to move your body through X, Y, and Z coordinates to be in the best place for a successful outcome. Even more reason to have proper mind training and strategies that include fixed gaze and steady breath. The research demonstrates without a doubt that elite decision makers, SWAT team members, for example, use steady gaze techniques to assist making rapid decisions in time-critical situations, which include objectives and alternatives. When it comes to keeping your gaze steady and moving through X, Y, and Z coordinates quickly and efficiently, I'd encourage you, go back and watch some of Mike Tyson's training, or for that matter, many of the peekaboo-style boxers, because that's exactly what they try to utilize more often than not to create making their opponent miss and yet putting them in the best position to launch an attack. You're going to see examples where they make professional boxers miss 4, 5, 6 times as they're continuously moving ahead. But when we pull ourselves out of the confrontational movement of things, it's important to also remember that before that ever happens, there's going to be more subtle clues, but really good clues that we can learn to pay attention to. And that leads us to understanding that body language transforms from movement to action. One of the other areas that we can utilize motor resonance is with the awareness of body language. The body language that I'm referring to is going to be associated when you ask a question and how they respond to you, which is action toward an object. I was reminded while writing this part of how futile it was for me growing up to not tell the truth to my family sometimes over, little stuff. My grandfather was a police officer. Dad was a highway patrolman. My uncle was a parole officer. All trained and very experienced in detecting shortcomings in response to questions like, "Hey son, did you clean your room up good?" I realize based on some of the things that I've learned now that I had no chance, but didn't know that at the time. The reason that body language is part of the motor resonance is remembering the fundamental units of motor cognition, which is defined as maneuvers produced to satisfy an intention towards a specific motor goal or in reaction to a meaningful event in the physical and social environments. So when you ask certain questions or make certain types of statements, their motor response, their body language, is what you're looking for as part of meaningful information. The introduction to body language was written by Dr. Christine Tipper at the Frontiers of Science, and you can find her information at frontiersn.org. And her work is titled Body Language in the Brain, Constructing Meaning from Express Movement. Express movement in her essay is synonymous with what we've defined as action in this episode and in Kung Fu Podcast number 170, Martial Action versus Movement. Body language is just more subtle than reaching for a knife, but it is just as important to get a catalog on what things are happening so that you learn how to read what's going on. Dr. Tipper writes, quote, "Body language is a powerful form of nonverbal communication, providing important clues about the intentions, emotions, and motivations of others. In the course of our everyday lives, we pick up information about what people are thinking and feeling through their body posture, mannerisms, gestures, and the prosody of their movements. This intuitive social awareness is an impressive feat of neural integration, the cumulative result of activity in distributed brain systems specialized for coding a wide range of social information. Reading body language is more than just a matter of perception. It entails not only recognizing and coding socially relevant visual information, but also ascribing meaning to those representations. She goes on to write that we know a great deal about brain systems and how they're involved in the perception of facial expressions, eye movement, body movement, hand gestures, and goal-directed actions, and as well as those mediating effective decision and motor responses to social stimuli. But what is still missing is an understanding of how the brain reads body language. Beyond the decoding of body motion, what are the brain substrates directly involved in extracting meaning from effectively laden body expressions? The brain has several functional specialized structures and systems for processing socially relevant perception information. A subcortical, pulvinar, superior colliculus, amygdala striatal circuit mediates reflex-like perception of emotion from body posture, particularly that of fear, and activates commensurate reflective motor responses." End quote. Whew, boy, that was a mouthful. But I can tell you, she knows what she's talking about when it comes to reading body language. In fact, Body Language 101 by Police Officer John Bowden helps us put all that science into work. So as Dr. Tipper writes about how it works, Officer Bowden is going to tell us how it works in his article, Quickly Read, Analyze, and Interpret Body Language. John Bowden is a former police officer with over 37 years of experience and has operated in every aspect of law enforcement, which includes crime scene technician, investigations, and undercover operations. He is also the founder and director of Applied Police Training and also has an excellent article on gentle interrogations you may want to check out too. But here, in his 101 version of body language, he breaks it down into a couple of areas for us. First is truth and deception, and the next is positive and negative. At this point, Officer Bowden gives us an example of what an officer may ask a subject that you know knows something about a theft. However, I'm going to pull it out of that context for something a little less formal, something that we might use. In psychology, they call it a volatile conundrum, which is where you suspect something, but you don't want to come across as interrogating. A person who is exercising deception is going to struggle in their body language and tone when you put them in a volatile conundrum, which that's why I said you can think of it kind of like a preemptive strike. The scene here is that we have a teenager who supposedly went to the movies on Friday night. Here it is Saturday morning, and you don't want to come across as interrogating them, but you do want to find out whether or not they actually went. You have some suspicions. So as you're talking, and the teenager makes a comment about how the movies were and things like that, and you say, well, you know, when I was looking at the TV last night, it had a flash that there was some sort of like fire alarm or somebody pulled the fire alarm or there was some fire trucks over to the theater last night. That must have been a real pain in the rear end to have to drop the movie to go outside for that fire alarm. Now, a deceptive person is going to start to fidget and come up with some sort of answer. Either way, they're going to hang themselves with the rope that you give them. What you're hoping for is the teenager looks at you and goes, "There was no fire alarm there last night." That's where you have to have your escape clause, and you make a comment like, "Well, I just must have misread it. What's on the plans for the day?" When you use a volatile conundrum, you're going to make things go into motion, and you want to pay attention as they shape up afterwards. Officer Bowden gives 5 traits to observe after you, for example, have asked this question or made a statement, and then the details on each. We're going to go through some of those here. The first one is behavior, the physical behavior that is observed during the responses. Eye contact. If they break eye contact with you, even for a moment, and then come back as if they're looking to see if you accept their answer. Then you want to listen to the answer itself, the timing of the response, and then their voice. The characteristics of their tone, speed, and volume are all the 5 traits that you want to learn to pay attention to. It is in these first 2 that I want to highlight that speaks about recognizing differences in movements and action. Officer Bowden writes, quote, behavior. Evaluate only the behavior that is in response to and resulted from the asking of the question. Do not consider movement that occurs between questions and could be considered movement that is the norm for that person during the questioning. So he identifies meaningful movement, which we call action, and less meaningful movement in between the questions. Then the other part he talks about is eye contact. And he says, look for breaks in eye contact when the subject is answering the question. A truthful subject will maintain good eye contact. When the deception person answers the question, they may break eye contact, however briefly. They may resume eye contact after the question, sometimes as if they're looking to see whether or not you're accepting the answer. I thought about bringing in the body language references, tactical decision-making processes with alternatives, and as well as gaze control, which puts these systems together, could give you other ways to utilize motor resonance in your martial arts training, and as well as help with self-protection skill development. So in closing, I want to set a reminder that Dr. Vickers says that the type of gaze control that accompanies excellence in dynamic motor skills, which is what we do, is not the rapid and dynamic type of eye movement, as compared to the calm, cool, and collected gaze straight ahead. Keep your head slightly on a swivel, look around a little bit, but don't be just bouncing all over the place with your eye movement. Your gaze is like a GPS system. Learn to use it. Anxiety disrupts the dorsal and ventral systems, which is going to lead to poor performance. Use fixed gaze and breathing techniques to keep your gaze steady, which usually, if you're just helping someone deal with a one-on-one situation, learn to look forward and not pay attention to any one specific thing. And for goodness sake, don't look for movement. Look forward and you'll begin to see their actions take shape. Trust yourself and develop that mind and eye training. Quiet eye training can also be very beneficial for children, especially those with learning or movement difficulties. As an addition to this bonus episode, I'm also going to include the gazing exercises, the 5 that I typically will do on a regular, even though I have 12. We do them to help us train the continuity of eye movement. Visual cues are one of the primary stimulants for motor resonance, as we've heard before. You can train your eyes like I have for years without having anywhere close to perfect vision. Also, remember that once you're in grappling proximity, vision is way overrated. It's not nearly as important as your ability to feel the tactile pressures and movements in your skin. As we have discussed, perception and action processes are functionally intertwined. Perception is a means to action, and action is a means to perception. Our brain can govern motor activity to transform sensory patterns into patterns of motor coordination. Training the muscles and nerves that move your eyes and improving blood flow is also very helpful. Your eyes don't need to be 20/20 on a chart. They have a built-in priority that the military is very aware of, and they take advantage of it. Your eyes will detect in this priority motion, color, and shape. So whether or not you can read that little tiny line down there on the chart doesn't matter as much if you can tell motion, color, and shape. Now, to improve the eye's ability to maintain continuity of motion while observing, these 5 next exercises can help. The first one is to look into the quiet, and that's where you do the Mr. Miyagi, rub your hands together, and then cup your hands and put them over your eyes so that the hollow of your hands are just over your eyes, and that you do not have any space between the edges of your hands and your nose or around the edges on the outer aspects of your eyes. Then from there, open your eyes, look into the darkness and visualize a little bit for just about a minute or so. It's actually very calming for some of the kids, and you can give them other things to do as well. The next exercise is to squeeze and pop open. This is where you squeeze your eyes together for 3 seconds, then pop them open for 3 seconds. Do that 7 times. The third exercise is to close your eyelids and then make big circles 7 times in each direction with your eyes. The next one is a lot of fun too. It doesn't last real long with kids, but it's actually pretty amazing of how well it works, is to put a marker or a sticker on a piece of glass and then sit about 6 to 8 inches away from that marker. Look through it and past it onto something that is in the distance for 15 seconds and then change your gaze back to the sticker. Go back and forth about 5 times, 15 seconds each. And then the last one, which is a lot of fun for the kids as well, is what I just call the wiffle ball swing. Basically what you do is just hang a wiffle ball from the ceiling and just swing it left and right. Keep your head still, just use your eyes, following it back and forth, and then also toss it back and forth so it's coming to you and away from you, and just track it with your eyes as it comes to you. That one can be a lot of fun. You'll get, try to avoid blinking if you at all can. These exercises are not designed to improve chart reading, but rather to improve the eye's coordination and the responses to movement. Remember that a trained gaze puts the dorsal and ventral systems into sync with one another and gives you your best chance to perform well. I hope that you've enjoyed this bonus episode on motor resonance, where you can look into the martial mind, perceptions, volatile conundrums as a preemptive strike into movement so that you can read body language 101, eye continuity, and many aspects of our training that we could put into play anytime. You can use this almost work during the day when you're not necessarily in the dojo or the Kwoon. You can learn to pay attention to things almost anywhere you are. I hope you have a great practice today, and I get to see you at the Shirite Bujitsu Kai. Remember, if you want more information on that, kungfupodcast.com/Shirite. Take care, and I'll be talking with you again real soon.